Super Tetris 3 for the Super Famicom, conceived by Bulletproof Software, the same folks responsible for the very first version of Tetris to grace the original Nintendo Famicom, a game most folks might not have played since that was also a Japan-only release. Bulletproof Software also developed a version of Tetris that most people have played. That's the one on the original Game Boy that was packed in with the system and was pretty much the killer app for the Game Boy. Now, while there were a couple Tetris games released here locally in some form or fashion on the various Nintendo consoles, the Japanese market saw a few more Tetris games released courtesy of Bulletproof Software, and this is one of them. I don't know where I was going with that last point, but we're just gonna let that hang there for a bit, wither away, and eventually die, and then we'll move on. Still waiting for that last point to die. Ah, there we go. Now we can move on. Super Tetris 3 has 4 variants to choose from: Tetris, Magicalist, Sparkless, and Familess. Let's blow through these rather quickly. First off, you have Tetris, which is pretty much the standard Tetris that can be played in either endless marathon play or in the standard mode where you clear 25 lines to move on to the next stage. The standard mode is essentially a throwback to the original Famicom version of Tetris released in 1986, right down to the remixed tunes from that game. Unlike that particular iteration, the controls are a little more forgiving here, but we'll touch on that later. Magicalist is an alternate version of Tetris with a silly name, as well as a couple added gimmicks: multicolored blocks and gray blocks. As you rotate your falling pieces, they'll also shift colors, and while you could play Magicalist as you would regular Tetris, your main aim here is to match up lines of blocks with the same color, which will cause all blocks of that color to clear the screen. Sometimes you'll have gray blocks that will stick around even if you clear lines, which messes with the gravity of the various blocks for a bit. But performing a Magicalist will give these blocks color. There are also these shiny blocks that are shiny. Like the standard Tetris, you could either play Endless Marathon or the standard 25 line clear thing. Next up, we have Sparkless, which is basically a remixed version of the Tetris variant Bombless, and also wins points on presentation with its fantasy-based visuals and rockin' tunes. Much like in Bombless, your goal in Sparkless is to form lines that will trigger bombs to clear the wall of blocks. The difference here is that whereas in Bombless, the bombs would explode in grand enough fashion, in Sparkless, bombs shoot out along the X and Y axis, similar to a bomb explosion in Bomberman. It's a different dynamic on the formula, but if you're familiar with Bombless, then it shouldn't take long to adjust to Sparkless's unique situation, as it were. And then there's Familess, which is basically 4-player Tetris. Since I don't have a multi-tap which is required to play 4-player Tetris, I couldn't test this thing. But I imagine this would be fun for a whole family and a notable selling point if nothing else, so that's something. In any event, Super Tetris 3 is another decent Tetris outing for the most part, with a couple alternative modes of play for variety as well as that multiplayer thing. Much like the previous iteration, Super Tetris 2 plus Bombless, this cartridge features a save feature where you can store up to 8 different profiles to keep track of your progress in the various modes of play. Seeing as this was released before 2001, when there was a set of official Tetris guidelines, Super Tetris 3 features no hard drops like in Famicom Tetris. There's no multiple piece previews, no infinite spins, no ghost pieces, and no semblance of super tight controls. One of the issues I had with Super Tetris 2 plus Bombless was that control was somewhat on the loose side. One press on the D-pad was enough to careen your piece towards a wall at warp speed, and even the dropping speed when you hold down seems way too fast to be considered a soft drop. This gave players used to a more lax control setup a bit of a culture shock and an additional adjustment to make before you can comfortably play the game with the loose controls. Now, Super Tetris 3 retains the slippery control setup that has been a hallmark, and it still takes a bit of getting used to. Now, don't take this to mean that this completely ruins the overall game, because it really doesn't. Other than the overall adjustment to the looseness of the controls, playing Super Tetris 3 is almost like playing any other Tetris. The core aspects haven't changed that much, and it's still very much playable, and once you get a good groove going, Super Tetris 3 starts to shine. As far as the alternate modes go, they're alright I guess. Magicalist feels a bit too gimmicky for my taste with the rotating colors and the gray blocks, but it's not too far of a deviation from the base Tetris formula that you just can't play it like a normal Tetris session, assuming you could position the gray blocks to be as non-distracting as possible, which sometimes can be difficult. And as far as Sparkless goes, Well, if you enjoyed Bombless, then this is a slight variation that provides a bit of a twist, and the presentation is actually top-notch here, but that slight twist makes me prefer Bombless over this. What can I say? I like my explosions to be big, and not Bomberman-ish unless it's in Bomberman. In terms of visuals and presentation, it really depends on the mode of play because each mode is presented slightly differently from each other in regards to the backgrounds and some of the layout pieces. But for the most part, the main layout is generally good with the playfield dimming the background so that it's easier to keep track of what's going on in the main playfield. Each mode has its own unique layout as far as the HUD is concerned, almost as if they're completely different games even though they're all technically the same game with some gimmicks tacked on. It's a nice gesture, and the backgrounds are well done with the shifting skies over the Russian castles in Tetris and the varied backdrops of Magicalist. Sparkless wins hands down in terms of presentation, with its amazing fantasy-themed backdrops and overall atmosphere. And oh yeah, those are some rockin' tunes in the background that you're hearing there in Sparkless. So rockin' in fact that they're keeping me awake for another hour so I can finish the rest of this recording and before going off to bed at 5 in the morning. Which I guess is a nice segue to sound, which is pretty solid. Perhaps the one upgrade that Super Tetris 3 made over its predecessor is the additional vocals for whenever you clear away lines, complete stages, or just fail miserably. They're a nice touch and they're in clear enough quality, but not much more than that. Sound effects are adequate fare for the most part, and the musical bits are decently composed, with the Sparkless tracks being the big highlight here because those are some awesome tracks. Each mode has its own share of tracks, with Tetris mode remixing tunes from the original Famicom release, and these are fine. Magicalist has its own musical bits and they're not bad, but Sparkless has the best of the bunch, gets you in the mood, full of energy, just great listens overall. And, well, overall, Super Tetris 3 on the Super Famicom is another serviceable Tetris offering with a couple additional gimmick modes tacked on for good measure. The game still maintains its predecessor's loose control, which takes a bit of getting used to, but doesn't kill the entire package outright. Magicalist and Sparkless may be acquired tastes, but for anyone with a super multi-tap, this game offers 4-player Tetris and that ought to be fun for a good time. All in all, a fairly decent version of Tetris and one worth checking out if you're into Tetris. And if not, well, this probably won't change your mind, but that's okay. This one's so far off it wouldn't have been on your radar unless you were actively looking for it, or you came across it by complete accident, or something to that extent, I really don't know. And now that I'm done, I'm off to bed because I'm dead tired, so good night.